Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast, where we provide you with your weekly diagnosis of everything fantasy football. Whether it's season-long leagues, dynasty, DFS, or sometimes even IDP, we got you covered all year long.
Let's do it. Let's get to it. Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast. I'm your host, John June, and this right here, this is the final installment of our NFL divisional breakdowns. So naturally, had to save the best for last. Had to bring in probably the first friend I ever had in the fantasy football community. Me and this guy played in a dynasty league together for a long time. We started out as rivals. We've since become very good friends. I'm talking about my guy, Sonny Platt, the host of the Big Knowledge Football Dynasty podcast. Sonny, been a long time coming to get you on here, brother. But thank you for coming on. And how you doing today, man?
John June, man, it's good to be on. You've been grinding on this thing, making so many podcasts. So I'm very honored to be on for one thing, to be representing the Broncos for one thing, and also just to be wrapping this thing up with you, man. Thank you for having me on. And I appreciate you, by the way, for being there for me as a Broncos fan when the Broncos passed on Justin Fields, because that meant a lot. You might have been the only person who reached out to me with sympathies. And it was funny because I don't think everyone knew how bad I was hurting and how shocked I was. So I appreciate you, man, on many levels.
No, man, definitely, brother, because I was hurting for you, man. I really wanted – you know what? Let's just get into the Broncos. 2020, went 5-11. Vic Fangio enters his third season as the head coach for the Denver Broncos. 12 wins in 2 seasons. They've really struggled as a team despite – especially last year, they were 13th in overall defensive DVOA, 11th in pass defensive DVOA, as per footballoutsiders.com. They've struggled mainly because of poor quarterback play, mainly from Drew Lock, who enters his third season here. But they did make a trade for Teddy Bridgewater, which unfortunately made them feel comfortable enough to pass on Justin Fields at 9 overall. So, they did add Patrick Surtain Jr. in that transaction there, but they're loaded on defense already, Sonny. I mean, obviously, anyone watching really thought the pick was going to be Fields. What is the vibe now around Denver? How are Denver Broncos fans feeling, about that draft pick? And what are their thoughts about 2021?
Well, I can't speak for the vibe in Denver because I'm here in California, but I will say as a Broncos fan and just I've been doing a lot of reading and just I always fill out the training camps and stuff. It doesn't seem like that many people were upset about it, to be honest. Like, it kind of was a moment for at least me and my brothers and a few other Broncos fans where it's like, what happened here? But it does seem like they seem to trust the brain trust. I don't know. I feel like the further we get away from it, seeing Aaron Rodgers resign, it's like, I feel like I kind of was trying to rationalize at one point, and then I'm thinking like, no, I think they made a mistake because Patrick, like you said, their defense is really good, and Patrick Surtain, I mean, how many games does a defensive back really win you compared to your quarterback, the guy who has the ball in his hand? So they must not have believed in Justin Fields. I'm not a scout, a GM, so I'm going to leave that to them. But it was disappointing, especially when you consider the guys they have on the roster right now. I mean, Drew Lock, as a Broncos fan, I usually find ways to try to convince myself that I like a player. And Drew Lock, I've never liked him. I traded my shares away early last year. I just didn't feel confident. I felt like there was such hype about the weapons around him, but it was like this team, and I didn't see him kind of stepping into that role. And I don't know. I think that the team wants Drew Lock to step up. I think that's why they got Bridgewater. I think a lot of people are assuming they brought Bridgewater in to kind of take the starting job. Personally, I don't see it that way. I think that they're actually aiming to have Lock as the quarterback, and then maybe Bridgewater is like a fallback plan. So maybe he's shown more to them than us, or maybe they just, they have something else in mind next year. But that's the problem I have with Elway and a lot of this leadership is Elway can't stand losing, so he's content being mediocre. He's fine with the team that's mediocre, which puts them in position to rarely get a shot at a quarterback. So when Justin Fields falls to you, you would think that would be the moment that you would say, we got this opportunity. Let's go ahead and take a shot on it at least. Take a big swing, right?
I would hope so. I mean, John Elway, former baseball player, you'd hope he'd like to hit home runs. And that's what Justin Fields is. He's a home run, man. I mean, like you said, we're not scouts or GMs or anything, but Justin Fields, his playing style, his draft, I guess, process really reminds me of Deshaun Watson, where it's like, what are we second guessing this guy for? Like, we've seen him do it. We've seen him went toe to toe with Clemson, beat Trevor Lawrence on a big stage. Like, what are we questioning Justin Fields' ability to play football? And to me personally, I would have, as a Jets fan, I would have taken him if I was making the decision. Would have taken him with the number 2 pick. Not that I don't like Zach Wilson or anything. He's not going to be a good player, but I just prefer Justin Fields. When you look at today's game and look where the NFL is going, Justin Fields is that, right? Like, he fits that to a T. And so I really thought that he should have been the pick for the Denver Broncos. But like you said, John Elway does not like losing, and therefore he's going to add, give his head coach another corner. Hey, you play in a division with Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, Derek Carr. Maybe Justin Fields would help, but hey, if not Justin Fields, then let's go get a corner. So we're talking about the quarterback position, Sonny. Let's talk about Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater. Drew Lock, like I mentioned, wasn't very good last year. Started 13 games, missing 3 with an injury. He completed 57% of his passes, 2,933 yards, 16 touchdowns to 15 interceptions, which is definitely not good. Also added 160 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. He was the QB 24 in fantasy points per game, averaging 13.9 points per game. Teddy Bridgewater in Carolina did not fare much better with the Panthers, completing 69% of his passes for 3,733 yards. Both those career highs, by the way, but 15 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. These guys in terms of ADP are the last 2 quarterbacks being drafted, with Drew Lock coming in at QB 36, Teddy Bridgewater coming in as QB 37. It seems like fantasy managers want nothing to do with either one of these guys, Sonny. How do you feel?
I think that's the key point here, is that in terms of especially one quarterback, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for either of them. Neither of them are relevant. You get into 2 QB, Superflex, then we're talking relevant. And I think I thought I was listening to Justin Simmons, the safety, and he was talking just here in training camp, and he was talking about Drew Lock and how he thought Teddy Bridgewater being there helped Drew. And he was just talking about, he said, I think Teddy Bridgewater is really helping Drew Lock. So that kind of, to me, there was something about that statement that kind of lends to the fact that I do think that they're leaning towards trying to have Drew Lock be the guy, because it just doesn't seem like a very relevant statement if you're talking about the potential starter being good for the backup. Like, that only makes sense if you're talking about the potential backup being good for the starter. And in the way he kind of prefaced it, it just seemed like he was saying, like, yeah, I think the presence of Teddy will help Drew be a better quarterback. And there were signs with Drew Lock. He made some really amazing throws. When we talked about the Haskins thing, I think is part of the Justin Fields. There's some kind of a Haskins effect for me. And so when I looked at Haskins, one of the things I felt like is I just didn't see, or still at this point now kind of learning more about what went on in Washington, that it doesn't seem to me that he loves football. Like, he's super maniac, passionate about just learning everything in football. It's like certain positions you can get away with not loving football, but that quarterback position, you got to be a maniac obsessed. So I kind of get that vibe about Drew Lock as well. Like, it seemed that the whispers I heard in Denver were very much like, yeah, he just doesn't really like hit the playbook. He's not like super obsessed with the film. He's got that swag. Sure, he likes to make the play here and there. But when it really comes down to it, is he winning? No. Is he, he's throwing 16 touchdowns. He's throwing 15 interceptions. Sure, their weapons were kind of depleted. And so we can give him that chance. And I think that, honestly, if you ask my opinion, I think that's what's going to happen. They're going to give him that chance. Then they can always go back to Bridgewater and they have the floor and they kind of know what they're getting. But I would think that just to build his confidence and to kind of see what he can do with the weapons and see if he's grown, that we'll probably see Locks get that opportunity first.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Like, Teddy Bridgewater being the veteran, being the guy that knows how to prepare. He watched Drew Brees do it. He's been the backup. He's been the starter. I mean, he's kind of been through it all, Teddy Bridgewater, in his career. And so I think he definitely helps Drew Lock. I see this situation being one where, Drew Lock, like you said, I think he like maybe you said this, maybe you didn't, but he gives them more upside. Whereas like Teddy Bridgewater is like the safe option, where it's like, okay, well, we don't want to lose this game. Teddy Bridgewater, like, you just manage it for us. Whereas, what is this guy's name? Drew Lock, on the other hand, he's the guy that's like, he's just gonna chuck it down the field. So it strikes me as like, if I'm not saying that if I'm an NFL coach, but I could just see a world where it's like Teddy Bridgewater is. Maybe you're right. Like maybe it starts the season, but like in my head, I was like, maybe Teddy Bridgewater starts out games, and then they need to come back or something. Teddy Bridgewater just doesn't have the juice, and so they're just like, hey, Drew Lock, just go YOLO, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really depends on how Drew Lock shows out in camp and preseason. If Drew Lock shows up and is impressive and it shows like he's learned from some of the things that he did last year, then I think they'll give him that chance. But yeah, if he looks like the same player, I think that they really believe they can win. So they're kind of like, okay, you're not even helping us win in a lot of cases. You're causing us to lose. That trade-off will probably be more, it helps with their defense, their running game, to just have Bridgewater in there and kind of know what you're getting as a coaching staff. But I really think the most important thing for us as fantasy gamers, just knowing who's going to start, is really their weapons and it makes a difference. It's like Drew Lock might maximize some of the weapons, but he might prefer a Cortland Sutton or somebody over, say, a Jerry Judy. That's the interesting dynamic that I think for us as fantasy gamers. Drew Lock is the only one who could potentially reach any sort of level of usability, especially in a one QB league. And then in terms of the weapons, we have to see who they favor to see which guys might be more viable. But you would think the upside, just like with Locke, his weapons would be have more upside unlocked as well if he's the quarterback.
Yeah, and I think I kind of agree with that, right? Like the upside goes up with Drew Lock as the quarterback, but Cortland Sutton will still be very much. We'll talk about the wide receivers. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Let's talk about the running backs. Javonte Williams was traded up for in the second round. JJ Zachariason, the late round quarterback, did a study earlier in the year capturing the difference between these trade up running backs and those guys, and how those guys see an increase in rush attempts compared to the average non-traded up for their average non-traded up for counterparts. So he's expected to at some point to take over as a lead back. He's a physical back out of UNC, so there's definitely something to keep an eye on. But Melvin Gordon, on the other hand, he's a veteran back, provides some legitimate competition to the rookie in Williams. Melvin Gordon was the leading rusher for the Broncos last year, 215 carries, 986 yards, and 9 touchdowns. Also added 32 receptions for 158 yards and 1 touchdown on 44 targets. This was good enough for an RB23 finish in PPR points per game at just over 13 points. Sonny, these guys are going off the board as RB25 and RB30 according to 4for4.com's multi-site ADP. How are we feeling about these price tags on either one of these guys?
Where are they going overall? I was looking at the Fantasy Pros earlier, and I think it was like a round difference only, or maybe it was 13 picks ahead or something.
Yeah, it's like a round difference. Let me get the exact number for you. According to 4for4.com, Javonte Williams is the 609, while Melvin Gordon is the 803. So about a round difference, 2 rounds, round and a half.
It's hard to say, honestly. I feel like people are underestimating Melvin Gordon in this situation. I love JJ Zachariason. I think he does a great job. And I wouldn't say I disagree with him, but I think that when you're looking at those situations, rarely has any of those situations had a back that was traded up for in the second round that also was going into a situation where a player like Melvin Gordon was already there. And so Melvin Gordon, to me, you look at his career up to this point, and there's a lot to like. He kind of had a half year with the Chargers, and then last year was kind of mixing in with Philip Lindsay. So I think his body isn't overly used. I think that he has a lot of confidence. I listened to him in an interview talking just about the situation. I found it funny because he talked about Javonte Williams. He talked about how he spent too much time and too much energy maybe on the battle with Philip Lindsay. Not so much that he was overly emphasized the competition between him and Philip Lindsay, but more so that the fans as a Broncos fan, I'll tell you, we all love Philip Lindsay. Like Philip Lindsay, I'm not even from Denver, but all the Denver fans, like I grew up in Colorado. It didn't matter. I just loved him as a guy, but also the fact that he was from Colorado and everything. It just made it really hard for Melvin Gordon to kind of like win fans over. And you get signed to this contract, you want to go into a team, you want them to love you, and all of a sudden they all hate you because you're taking time away from the beloved Philip Lindsay. He said it kind of got in his head. And so he was kind of like, I'm not getting focused on the competition, with Javonte Williams, blah, blah, blah. But then 2 seconds later, he's kind of talking about how Javonte had nice feet and good vision, but went on to say kind of like, but this is training camp. And once the season starts, it gets faster. And then we'll get to see what he does under the lights. So there's still a little challenging. If you kind of read into his body language, it was almost an assumed position that he's going to be the lead back, Melvin Gordon is. And that he's expecting, it's like, sure, you brought in a good dog. He called him a dog a couple of times. You brought in a good kid, but I'm used to competition. You had Eckler, now he's competing with Philip Lindsay, now he's competing with. So I think in his mind, he's still a very good running back. He expects to get that workload. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. I just think that the Broncos are paying him. It does, like in most situations, you wouldn't expect the team to spend not only a second round pick, but trade up in the second round for a running back, which has like a limited shelf life and there's no value in like waiting and conserving them and not use them. At the same time, at the pace they may want to run the ball, we know now with 17 games, there's a lot of need for another running back, if not 2 more running backs. And so having 2 stud running backs like the Cleveland Browns have is not a bad thing. And so you can have 2 good players who both can catch the ball, both can run the ball, and hopefully can both stay healthy. And if they can't, then one of them becomes the bell cow. So it doesn't seem to me like the value is there with Melvin Gordon because he's only 1 round later. But I don't necessarily know that the value is there with Javonte Williams either, because I think at least in terms of this year, it's probably some kind of a cap ceiling. I think that he's going to have to deal with Melvin Gordon unless Gordon gets hurt. So that's where I think that they both have some value. If you can get one of them at an extra value, like Melvin Gordon falls a little more, which I would expect could happen, or in Dynasty, if you can get him kind of for a 1 year, 2 year rental, I think it's worth it. I think he's still a good player. And I've always there's a lot of things about his game. And I think the consensus when people look at his career the last couple of years, there's devaluing things all along the way. Like he's getting older. He had, he had to compete with Philip Lindsay, that he didn't even get his contract he wanted. But all those things are kind of already calculated into his price, especially at least in Dynasty they are. And so I think he's a value in that terms. And redraft, it's year to year, it's hard to say. And so barring injury, I think neither of them are going to be like superstar, but I think both of them will be quite usable because I think the Broncos, if they get what they want, are going to be running the ball quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that from a redraft perspective, Melvin Gordon's probably a guy that you'll probably get later, and he'll probably start out this season as the Broncos lead back, and you could probably use him for some of those weeks while you start sorting the roster out, trying to get some wins. Javonte Williams will probably be that guy that, as the season progresses, he's getting more work, getting more opportunities. The other thing that we kind of forget is that there's a whole other side to, because I bring this up with Antonio Gibson, like there's this whole other side to playing running back that we often don't think about, which is like, how do you do on third down? Like, how do you do in pass protection? Like, yeah, it's great that you can catch the ball, but like, can you identify the blitzer? Can you fill in where you're supposed to be in the protections? And Melvin Gordon can do that. He's proven that. I think, when we talk about a team that's going to win now, that tries to win now, and you look at some of the moves they've made that they kind of show that, I think Melvin Gordon probably does start out the season as the guy. I'm not paying the price it costs to get Melvin Gordon on my team, just because, I'm not trying to deal with the rookie eventually taking his job. But if I can get him in the later rounds, like maybe round 9, round 10, and I'm able to get a guy like Melvin Gordon, definitely. But from a dynasty perspective, how do you feel about trading Melvin Gordon for, say, Brandon Ayuk?
Probably wouldn't do that. I think I would probably just keep that Ayuk cat. But hey, you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes. No regrets. No regrets, as they say.
Obviously, listeners aren't privy to this information. I'm referencing a dynasty trade you and I made during the draft last year, our rookie draft last year, where I really wanted the 112 and I really wanted to get rid of Melvin Gordon. So we were able to work that out. And Brandon Ayuk, here we go, to the moon.
Good trade for you.
Sorry, Sonny, didn't mean to bring that up on the air. But let's talk about the wide receivers. I'll cheer you up a little bit, right? Because the wide receivers is where it gets cheery when we talk about the Denver Broncos. We'll talk about Cortland Sutton first. Missed all but one game last year, which was week 2. He had 3 catches, 66 yards, but he's coming off an 1,100-yard season just the year prior. I think some injury and quarterback concerns are baked into his current price. At wide receiver, catch this, Sonny. According to 404.com's multi-site ADP, wide receiver 31 for Cortland Sutton. I'm sorry, that's just an absurd price for one of the alpha dog receivers in the NFL. What say you, Sonny?
I gotta say, I'm concerned about Cortland. I have shares of Cortland Sutton in terms of it was a major knee injury. It was not just an ACL. It was like a lot of other ligaments. A lot went on there. And he's a big guy. He is 25 years old, so he's right there in his prime. I think with the emergence of Jerry Judy, with the style of this team, I think people need to temper their expectations a little bit for Cortland Sutton. In my mind, how I'm always trying to look is be one step ahead. And with Cortland Sutton, I'm thinking like, I don't want to buy him right now. I look at where he's being drafted, and he's being drafted ahead of Jerry Judy still. And I think that there's actually, if anything, there's a likelihood that Judy kind of breaks out this year, especially if we have Teddy Bridgewater at quarterback, or just depending how it all shakes out with his injury and how he recovers and how quickly he returns to form. So I don't know. I would kind of like to wait and see, because I have a feeling he might start out a little slower than everyone expects, which might provide a buying window, because I do believe him in the long term. He's a good player, but I think that it was very strange to me how some players they get an injury and they lose considerable value. People just kind of write them up, like Paris Campbell. I mean, he went from being just like, he just continually dropped. But Cortland Sutton, he had established after one season, after this last year, 2 years ago, that he was kind of that guy and that he could be one of these alpha wide receivers. But we forget that he was like the only receiver on the team, and there was a lot of targets to be had. Put him now after a year removed, overcoming a major injury, a lot more targets. We're talking about the other wide receivers, the tight end, and just the team's overall mindset of probably wanting to run the ball more makes me think that he's not worth the cost. That's just how I'm, especially in redraft, where there's just so many other ones to choose from. It feels like it's too high. Honestly, like 31 is fine, but who are the other players in that range? I'm not looking at what you're looking at.
Yeah, no, I got you. In terms of wide receivers going in that range of wide receiver 31, we're talking about guys like some guys getting drafted ahead of him: Kenny Golladay, Chase Claypool, T. Higgins, Odell Beckham Jr., Juju Smith-Schuster. He's going one spot ahead of Robbie Anderson, 2 spots ahead of DJ Shark, and Devontae Smith and Jerry Judy are 34 and 35 respectively.
Yeah, I haven't done too many redraft yet, so depending on in that range, if I saw running backs or something, I don't hate it. I mean, it's all kind of comparable to me, so I could see him outperforming that ADP in a lot of those guys in that range. So I don't hate it. It's just, yeah, I feel like just in terms of the sense I get in terms of his loss of value, or how people expectations didn't lower that much, considering. And I've heard rumors that he looks great. I saw him running. He looked like he's able to cut and everything. But he's a larger wide receiver. I think he relies on that quickness. He's going to need, any bit of separation. He's never been huge on separation, but he's kind of a Golladay type guy, and I think being healthy is key when you like, it's a matter of inches for those guys sometimes. So yeah, I just want to see it, and especially when you have other guys, other options, and a running game that is looking pretty nice as well.
Yeah, I found myself gravitating towards Cortland Sutton in a lot of running back heavy builds. If I've gone through 3 running backs in a row, I often find myself with Cortland Sutton as like my number 2 receiver. Just because, again, I definitely hear what you're saying. As you were talking about it, I'm thinking about it like, all right, yeah, the quarterback is upgraded, but probably going to try to run the ball more. There's more targets around him, like in Jerry Judy and then Noah Fant, who, when last time Cortland Sutton played a season with Noah Fant, he was a rookie tight end, right? So, there's a big difference between Noah Fant then and Noah Fant now. So definitely something to think about. So let's talk about Jerry Judy. He was a guy that definitely had his moments in 2020. Definitely suffered from some poor quarterback play as well. On a team leading 113 targets, he produced 52 catches, 856 yards, and 3 touchdowns with a 46% catch rate. That's absolutely a terrible catch rate. Obviously, not entirely his fault. That catch rate has to regress, in my opinion, when you consider he was 105th of wide receivers in catchable target rate at 62.8% of the time. He had a true catch rate, which is basically receptions over catchable targets of 73.2%. So Judy was, he was 58, wide receiver 58 PPR points per game at just under 10 points, but has a chance to improve here on his fantasy finish from last year. And managers seem to think so because, like I mentioned before, going up the board as wide receiver 35. How are you feeling about Judy and the price?
I think he's going around later than Sutton, and depending on my build, I probably would feel comfortable with that, maybe even more comfortable than taking Sutton around earlier, only because there's part of me that just feels like it could be even, if not leaning towards Judy, especially if we see Teddy Bridgewater moving as the quarterback, just because of his timing and the kind of routes that he runs, where, you look at Drew Lock last year and a receiver that kind of stepped in for Cortland Sutton was Tim Patrick. And Patrick was was probably more successful and more productive in terms of efficiency than was Judy. And maybe that was partially because his playing style was more like a Cortland Sutton. So that's where, it's hard to say. It was a disappointing year for Judy, but and people talk about like his air yards. They talk about how many air yards he had. And I found it pretty funny because I heard somebody on Twitter or somewhere in the world was talking about prayer yards and how there's the air yards, but then there's just the prayer yards. And Drew Lock is like the king of the prayer yard, where he's just throwing balls up in the air. They're not even close to the receiver. So that gives you that uncatchable rate. That gives you those prayer yards because you're throwing the ball down the field, but it wasn't really a chance for him to make any kind of real production. So it's a lot to still be seen, but it's still impressive that he had 800 something yards on 50 catches. So there's that. This shows that there's some, potential there, and he got a lot of targets. But I don't know that his targets or share is going to just, keep going up. He's got a lot more competition. When we talk about KJ Hamler, talk about Tim Patrick, those guys are show that they're going to have to find ways to get him on the field. Those guys are productive players as well. So yeah, it concerns me about all the weapons in a sense, just because I don't know that the overall exciting offense is there either. When you talk about the mindset of a team, what they're actually trying to do, the brain trust, it doesn't feel like the Broncos brain trust is necessarily trying to throw the ball a lot and produce a lot of fantasy points for us. So even if they have those weapons, if they can have their way with playing good defense, running a slow, like slowing the game down, drawing more time, I think that's what they're going to do. And they're going to be one of those teams that's less fantasy friendly than others, both on offense and teams going against them. If that makes any sense.
No, that definitely makes sense. Jerry Judy, I mean, he's been somebody that I think I'm like all over this. I was all over this wide receiver class last year. I mean, I think almost everybody was. But I'm like all over it again this year, especially the guys that underperformed, like the Judys and the Henry Ruggs of the world, where it's like, hey, I think these guys have an opportunity here in year two. Like, they're the post-type sleepers. Like, everybody wants Justin Jefferson. Everybody wants CeeDee Lamb. Most people want Brandon Ayuk. But, when it comes to, Jerry Judy and Henry Ruggs, it's like nobody wants these guys. And, I'm not going to say nobody wants Jerry
Judy. Has more love. There's still a lot of love for Judy. I think Ruggs
is
the one that people are really hating on.
Yeah, nobody wants Ruggs, but Judy, still wide receiver 35. So, I mean, he's getting some love. I mean, when you look at really like where he's going relative to Cortland Sutton's wide receiver 31. So, he's close to being the number one drafted wide receiver on his team. But like you said, that 46% catch rate, there's got to be some regression there. And so I'm expecting him some positive regression, I should say. And I'm expecting him to really, come forward with that, with definitely ahead of a wide receiver 3 finish. But I think he can definitely get into that wide receiver 2 range, depending on how maybe these touchdowns and even these targets fall. We mentioned Tim Patrick. We talked a little, mentioned slightly KJ Hamler. What are the thoughts there? Any potential value? I know you mentioned that this is probably going to be a run first team, some ball control offense. Is there any intrigue, like maybe even from a dynasty perspective, with those two guys?
I think with Hamler probably. I mean, I like Tim Patrick and have a lot of shares as Patrick. He's getting older, and just unfortunately for him, for his position on that team, not likely to, unless somebody gets injured, to have a lot of relevance. But Hamler, I think he is kind of forgotten name when we talk about you just talked about the class last year and what a good class it was. And he was a 2nd-round draft pick. And I think he's lived up to all of those expectations aside from being kind of injury prone. I mean, it's funny because he's kind of, I see him as less, his ability to be a number 1 is less likely. He's more a Darnell Mooney to me, where I see, that's what I've always loved about Ruggs is I feel like Ruggs is that speed guy who has enough physical, is large enough. It has enough game that I think he could actually be a number 1, a Tyreek Hill type, where I see Hamler as more, kind of a Mooney at his best. But yeah, there's potential there. Dynasty would be where I was looking just because, unless there's an injury, but he is a name to watch. He's looked good in camp. He's been one of those players that for all intents and purposes, he's, a great weapon for a team. It's just in terms of fantasy, being able to rely on him, having any use for him starting in your fantasy lineup. When you look at all the other wide receivers across the league and that are available to you, it's hard to see any kind of redraft relevance.
Yeah, it'll probably be a guy that, bye week fill in, high over under, you kind of throw him in there, hope he doesn't get you a 0 type deal. Let's move on to the tight end position. But I hope the Saints make a trade for Tim Patrick because as you're talking about it, I'm like, hey, Tim Patrick with the Saints, that may be pretty nice.
There's somebody should make a trade for him. He's a good player. He showed he can play.
Definitely. Let's move on to the tight end position. And Noah Fant had a breakout season, which my co-host Greg Penniman predicted. He was his breakout tight end. He was his guy all summer. So kudos to Greg for that one. But came through second on the team, 93 targets, 15 games, which turned into 62 catches, 673 yards, and just 3 touchdowns. Finishes the tight end 8 in total fantasy points, averaging 10 PPR points per game. Going off the board right now, Sonny, is a tight end 8. Fant provides the upside that we kind of look for in those later rounds if we don't get these top guys early. Is there value here with Noah Fant? I think he's going in round 7. What would you say?
Probably not. It just seems like it's, last year when you look at the number of weapons that they had, the limited number of weapons, and he got 93 targets. I think in terms of dynasty, I think in terms of looking at the progression of his career compared to many tight ends, and he's on the fast track to being a stud in this league. Like you want to see everything you've wanted to see from him. He's explosive, catches the ball, he can block. He's going to be a great tight end. But we're talking about redraft. We're talking about this year. It's just hard for me to picture him being anything more than the tight end number 8. And if you're having to pay tight end 8 and it feels like that's tight end 8 with at the high end of tight end 8 because of the upside, because of the explosive, because he's like, he's the next guy that could emerge. And I could be completely off on this, but when I just look at how it projects and look at the Broncos weapons and how they're going to, he's and don't discount the other tight end, Albert Okwuegbunam, who, showed signs of being able to do a lot out of the seam and certain aspects of playing the tight end position that will also kind of just kind of take away a little bit of what a fantasy production. I think he's a great player. I think his career trajectory is really super high, but it's going to be a matter of him developing a little bit more, kind of depending on the quarterback they get, having more rapport, and then, seeing how far he can push into those elite tight end territory, where usually that guy as a tight end is the top or one of the top very targets of that team. I find that hard to believe that he's going to be, back up there as the second most targeted player on the team this year, but it's possible. Like I said, I really like him though.
Yeah, he's definitely a guy that, like we talk about the athletic abilities there. I think from a target and opportunity standpoint, you're 100% right. I mean, no Cortland Sutton last year. Jerry Judy as a rookie led this team in targets, so Noah Fant was second. You assume it, even if Cortland Sutton just falls to second to Jerry Judy, right? Like Noah Fant can't be higher than third. So what does that really look like? And maybe it comes down to what's the Broncos schedule look like? Are they going to be in a lot of passing situations? Then maybe Noah Fant has some opportunities. I know last year he was injured at points, and so he dealt with an injury there. I think it was a high ankle sprain he had. So, and I say this all the time. I've said this on throughout the series a few times. We often remember when players don't play. Like the Christian McCaffreys and the Saquon Barkleys. We remember that they didn't play, but we rarely remember when a guy got hurt and played through it. And a guy shouldn't play through a high ankle sprain and be okay. And Noah Fant was doing that, and he missed one game with that high ankle sprain, but ends up coming back, 2 weeks later. So maybe that impacted him in his season. And, maybe he's a guy that can make plays off the explosive play, because we know that that's what he's done before throughout his career. But yeah, it's definitely going to be something to watch. I mean, he averaged 14 yards a reception as a rookie, averaged, just under 11 last year. So I believe the real Noah Fant's probably somewhere in the middle of that. And if those yards per reception go up and those targets are, maybe not maybe close to what they were last year, which on a 17 game pace would be less targets per game. But I think that you could be looking at potentially a 700-800 yard season from Noah Fant, which would push him up into that tight end, that top 8 territory for a tight end, depending on, again, how those touchdowns would fall as well. Sonny, don't want to take up too much of your time, brother, but I got to ask you one last question as it regards to the AFC West. Who's winning this division? Where are the Broncos finishing in this division, and how's it breaking down?
Ooh, I think the Chiefs. You got to go with the Chiefs right now. I mean, they're a favorite to win the Super Bowl. If they can just shore up their offensive line, I think it's tough to go against the Chiefs. I'd love to tell you that the Broncos are competing in there, but I think that the Chargers would be my second favorite. I think the Broncos and the Raiders will be kind of just scrapping it out, and it could be luck, could be a matter of a game or two. I think both of them are decent teams. I think the Raiders could push for the playoffs. I think the Broncos could push for the playoffs. Those and the Chargers, could fall out of that mix depending on if there's regression with Herbert, or the new coaching staff comes in and is a little overwhelmed or something. So that, to me, there's always those variables, but I think you've got to stick with the Chiefs in terms of the whole AFC, let alone the AFC West. So that's how I'd see it playing out. But we could be hopeful. I honestly, that's kind of why I thought that Justin Fields was a good play there, because if you're going to try to go against a player like Pat Mahomes and now Justin Herbert, whatever, I think you need to just, make sure you're swinging for the fences. You can't be mediocre. And the Broncos seem to accept being competitive. And, I don't know. I'd rather just kind of find a way to beat the best. And I'm not sure that this is the approach. But, so maybe we lose a lot and we find a gem next year as a quarterback. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick Surtain won't help you score more points, but instead of losing by 28, you'll probably lose by 21 now. So, no, all in all, I definitely agree with how you have it breaking down. I think the Chargers will be legit this year. I've got them at over 9.5 wins, so that should be interesting. The Chiefs and the Broncos and the Raiders, I have them battling out for the 3rd and 4th spots. That'll be very close there. Sonny, man, I appreciate your time, brother. Obviously, I know some of the stuff that you're working on, but why don't you let everybody else know exactly what it is that you're working on and what you got cooking then?
Not too much. You can hear me on my podcast. I don't do a lot on Twitter. I'm not real active in social media. I don't have a website. So most of my thoughts, I collect them together and then I just put them out on my Big Knowledge Football Dynasty podcast. It's all Dynasty talk. I've talked to you and considered doing some kind of happy hour, DFS kind of thing. We've talked about different things, but for now, the content that I put out, the way my brain has been wired over this last so many years is pretty much dynasty oriented. I do play some redraft and feel like I can compete at that level, but at the same time, like my passion is dynasty. And so, yeah, you can check me out, Big Knowledge Football Dynasty podcast. That's pretty much it. And check out Fantasy for Unity, man. We're putting this together for the good. So that's the other thing, Fantasy for Unity.
Yeah, man, definitely. Obviously, check out Sonny and his Big Knowledge Football Dynasty podcast. I mean, Sonny, I can tell you from firsthand experience, is a very good dynasty player. And so you definitely want to check it out. I mean, I try to check it out so I can understand what he's doing in our rookie drafts. So, no, but obviously, I'm just messing. Sonny does great work, but definitely also make sure you check out Fantasy for Unity. I've mentioned it on here before, but me and Sonny, along with a friend of his and Alex, we're working on it together, trying to get this tournament filled. So if you have any interest in supporting a good cause, all you have to do is shoot a donation over either the ACLU, the Conscious Kid, or the Equal Justice Initiative at a minimum of $20. You DM that over to the Fantasy for Unity either Twitter account or Instagram, or you can email us at fantasyforunity@gmail.com, and we'll get you in the tournament. That's all you need. Minimum of $20 donation to one of these 3 amazing causes, and you can help make a difference and have some fun doing it. So we definitely appreciate that. Sonny, appreciate you, brother. We'll definitely do this again. I know we talk almost every day now at this point. So this will be good, man. And definitely looking forward to everything we got cooking, man. So everybody, we appreciate you. Appreciate you sticking with us for 32 of these right here. Your boy is exhausted though. Done. Let's get out of here. And we'll talk to you next week when Greg gets back. 2 shows a week. We're doing positional breakdowns. It's going to be a good time. I'm excited, y'all. Can't wait. And with that one, we're out of here. Peace, y'all.